Hi, everyone. Welcome to this panel on activism and social justice in relation to the climate crisis. I'm Natasha Gutierrez. I'm the editor-in-chief of Vice in Asia Pacific. And I am, like many of you, very, very, very eager to learn from our panelists because of social media, because of just all of the conversation around it. The word activism sometimes has had a bad rep. And so today we're going to talk about what it means to be a good activist, what it means to be inclusive. Obviously, there is no such thing as a perfect activist, but what can those in the industry or in activism really do to make people feel like it is not just for certain people? Because of course, this panel and the climate crisis that we're talking about affects all of us. So how can we all be more inclusive? And for people like me, who might not consider myself an activist, how can we also be effective allies in this? So I want to start the conversation with just one question for each of the panelists. Why did you get involved into activism?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm a community organizer. So I've been working in movement spaces in Singapore for about the last 11 to 12 years. So I've been working with feminist movements, LGBT movements, labor movements, different aspects of Singapore civil society's work. And how I got involved is that I volunteered for 1 year in a rural development NGO in rural India. And I was very inspired by how regular people got together to take collective action. And so organizing communities to take action on issues that matter to them is something that I think is really powerful and really important. And I think is part of a vibrant democracy. And so I felt drawn to doing that kind of work.
Thank you so much for having me and also organizing this really important discussion. I think there has been a lot of misconception about what activism is. There's a lot of negative connotation to it. I think in regions in Southeast Asia, it has been made so because activist means that you have to, deconstruct and reconstruct again how you view things, how action should be made, and things like that. So I started off my activism when I was studying in Germany. I joined a feminist movement, and from that feminist movement, I started to understand the different how gender has been. It's a very intersectional issue. Especially when you talk about industries, corporations, and also grassroots movements. And then when I came back to Malaysia, I started working with indigenous communities. That's where I started to work towards more grassroots collective work. And I believe that, everything, especially in Southeast Asia, to do some action, you have to change things in a very systematic way. Not systematic way, you have to change the system basically, and you can't work in silos. That's why that collective action, building coalitions are really critical, especially in this time.
I love that, especially you mentioning you started in feminism and then the interconnectedness, not just of these different advocacies, but also among the region. What does it mean to be an activist anyway?
I feel like this is such a difficult question because it's also so different per country and per community and per context. But for me, I think it's something that you have to come to terms with. And for me, activism is really about decentering yourself and your personal needs and thinking of a greater community. Knowing that you're not sacrificed, it's not some noble sacrifice of yourself, like in a white savior kind of way, but rather like your personal needs and your personal liberation comes with the collective liberation of everyone. And so decentering yourself in a way centers yourself also. Like decentering yourself doesn't mean you're sacrificing something, but knowing that the way to achieve like justice and liberation and everything means coming into that collective, coming into that community, as Nadia mentioned, coming into that coalition and coming together, realizing and recognizing the interconnections of all the other movements coming together. And I think that's what activism is to me. It's really about going beyond yourself, beyond your immediate community, and seeing how you have to work with different people, different movements in order to achieve things.
I would add that for me, activism is both a posture and a set of practices, right? And to me, the posture is one of availability, like staying available and present and attentive. And it's a posture of attentiveness to our socio-political realities and the lived experiences of communities and to possibilities for change. And I think it's a set of practices, and that sometimes when you say activist, it's really vague what it means that you do, right? So to me, that's why it's quite important to clarify for myself what is the way I show up as an activist, and that's why I identify as a community organizer, or as a writer, or a facilitator, or a researcher, because these are the forms of activist practice that I engage in.
The term activist, when we hear it, and I'm basically repeating what's probably very well understood, and Kokila mentioned that, it refers, or it appears to refer to an individual, but it is not. Activists can only exist within a community. It may be a community of 5 people, maybe a community of 500 people. So it is not a singular term, because the Western culture particularly honors, elevates the awards that are given here, and all of that tends to honor and elevate the individual over the collective. And that's the default position. For activists, there is no such thing. So we all come within a community. That's one thing. The second thing is what Kokila was mentioning, being actively engaged in. It's to do. It's a verb, in a way, in that sense. So what is then activism is actively participating. But the problem is that I'll tell you, like if you're in US academia, and let's say I'm a tenured full professor, so I don't have that problem to deal with. But if you, let's say you are a tenure track assistant professor who just finished their PhD and has just joined academia, and you announce yourself as activist, you might basically kiss goodbye to getting a tenure for the most part. So it is not looked at as a positive thing, which is extremely unfortunate. Active participation in democracy, that's what, like Kokila was saying, is what activism is about. The other thing I'll just mention is that for me, in addition to all of those things, is long engagement. So if you come into something as an activist because you think it's cool, your peers think it's cool, and I tell my students, your peers think it's cool to be part of, social media is saying it's a really cool thing to be a part of, you likely will leave that as soon as you get into it or shortly after. If it doesn't come from a very deep place of empathy, or whatever we may call care, empathy, concern, many numbers of things that comes from within, you're likely not going to stay very long.
You know, when you mention sort of that negativity and that negative connotation of being an activist and someone, you know, a professor going for tenure, it's very similar to, I think, many fields, right? Even in journalism, there's a whole debate of, can journalists also be activists? And I like how you all framed it in a way that doesn't necessarily have to be negative, right? However, you all also touched on sort of this long-term commitment. So is there a difference between volunteering and advocacy and allyship and activism? And is there some sort of hierarchy that gets you to a point where, okay, now you can call yourself an activist? Or is that just a general misconception that people think, oh, I don't have the right to be called this or that? And are all of these just basically tags that we don't need? Or is there value in that?
I was asked this question once in one of my, in the class that I've been to. And at that point, I was just starting off doing climate activism. And one of the professors asked me, who is an activist in this room? And then everyone, you know, said, oh, it's Nadia, and everyone laughs, you know. It's like, it's not the laugh that you feel comfortable with, like you're coming to a university and then calling yourself an activist. And then that kind of feeling, I still remember what it made me feel. It made me crawl. I think to tag our work with labels is such a limiting, limiting experience. I think like everyone here, we got into activism at different points of times of our lives. Everyone has their own tipping point. Everyone has their own experience, realities that when they come in and they do this work. So it's really sort of unfair to just say, oh, being an activist means you do more of this work. Being an advocate, you do more of, you don't go down the street and things like that. It's completely ridiculous for me.
Yeah, I just, sort of wanted to build on some of the things that that Nadia raised, right? So I think for one, what we call ourselves is also a reflection of the kind of political contexts that we're embedded in and what the discourses and narratives there are. I remember when I was much younger, I intentionally called myself an activist because it was seen as a bad word in Singapore, right? And it's something that the government would regularly cast in very undesirable and negative light. And so I think it was political for me to identify as that. But as time went on, it became to me less meaningful to use as a term instead of, say, more descriptive words of the kind of practices and work and movement spaces I'm engaged in. So I think those things also shift for us based on, it's relational, right? Like what is the narrative at a particular point in time? And is it significant and political for you to, and I think sometimes you choose it because it conforms and sometimes because it subverts. And I think all of us negotiate those things in our own context that are not always shared across different spaces. And I think also one of the things that's interesting to me is how the advent of activism is really a more recent phenomenon. And I say this very intentionally because I think that in just a few decades ago, it was much more common to be doing this work of political engagement and engaging in dissent and in organizing with your co-workers, with your communities, where you were at, right? So like, if you talk to like people who were active in civil society in Singapore in the 70s and 80s or 60s, they will say, we were not activists, we were students, we were lawyers, we were journalists who cared. And we got together with other people who cared in our space and we did work, right? And so to me, the advent of activism as how we now kind of fetishize it and set it apart from real life, has come with increasing control, censorship, and actually the disappearance of political space where we are at. Because now students cannot organize in Singapore, activists have to organize. Because journalists cannot publish independent thought, activists have to publish, okay? And because workers' rights has been extinguished completely, you have to be a migrant workers' rights activist to speak about these issues. So it's really, to me, the growth of activism is the complete erasure and increasing stifling of civil and political liberties across all of the spaces, right? And I think that's really important to recognize.
Do you guys feel pressure to also be active, to advocate for other social justice issues as well? Because everything is so interconnected, or does that sort of just come naturally?
So one of the things is that absolutely, because if there is anything climate justice has done, that it created that what we call, whatever, for the lack of a better word, intersectional space, where it's not just intersectional in terms of race, class, gender, abilities, and so on, but also these totally disparate issues of labor and what have you, land issues and energy issues, many different things. But I would suggest that we think slightly differently, in the sense that there has been a lot of talk about climate change is everything. And this is both productive and problematic, because what that does is it sucks the energy out of so many other issues that are of extreme significance. And they are interrelated, as Mitzi was saying, they're interrelated, but they are different. And one just example I'm giving you is like the biodiversity crisis. Biodiversity along with climate are the two And it was recognized by the United Nations in the same 1992 Historic Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, back way in 1992. The climate is the only one that has gotten any kind of a, more global momentum. And the biodiversity has been lagging and fester from public inattention. That said, both of those crises actually contribute to and escalate each other, but they are actually distinct, they're different. And so many other issues. So all to say is that everything, every space that we operate, whether it's gender studies, anything, and we learn from it, we just bring it to wherever we are working on. So I would just suggest not thinking of climate activism as an all-consuming, all-encompassing thing.
Also identifying our practices and our political commitments, not just through what issues we work on, like gender issues or climate issues or like migrant immigrant issues and things like that. It's also helpful to identify the politics that we are committed to, right? It's a liberationary politics or politics of socialism, or what are the ideologies that we and politics and political traditions that we draw from, right? What are the legacies that we are learning from and building on together? And that, I think, provides a really strong foundation for connecting different struggles together and building coalition and work. So it doesn't mean that everyone has to learn everything about everything and speak up about everything equally all the time. But I think it's recognizing that the work we do is especially if we are committed to working at structural and systemic levels, it creates the conditions for everybody's liberation, right? So I organize with, in Singapore, the Transformative Justice Collective, which is focused on, is an abolitionist organization focused on kind of demystifying carcerality in Singapore and building transformative justice alternatives, right? But when we work with people who have been incarcerated before, a lot of the issues that come up are labor issues, right, or gender issues. And also when, if there are workers that we organize towards a certain end that they are looking for legally. And so then that also creates, so it's also recognizing that the work that we do, if we think about it, especially from the context of these strong political traditions and also with a clear vision of what we're working towards, I think it will naturally affect our strategies in a way that we are building power together with other movements.
I think that's why we have to go beyond social justice into transformative justice. Instead of looking at this type of activism. Yes, focus on that, but understanding that they're connected. Like, again, you don't have to handle everything. You have to trust that the other movements, the other people, trust them. They got it covered. And I say this now as a climate activist. I hate it when people are saying that climate change is the single most important issue that the planet is facing, that humanity is facing. It's the end of the world. It's the one that ties everything together and is the one that's the biggest threat to humanity. Is that true? Who is it the threat to? Because there have been so many crises happening already. It's always been the end of the world for people of color, for Black people, for Indigenous peoples, for workers. These end of the world issues, these all-encompassing, they've already been existing. But then with the climate crisis, who is actually starting to maybe suddenly feel threatened? The white, old, rich men who are in power, who might actually be in trouble someday. And that's why they think, oh, this is the end of the world issue. But it's not. It has always been the end of the world for somebody already. And we shouldn't be leveling these socioeconomic crises as one of them higher than the other.
Just one quick example is I go back to both, like Kokila and Mitzi, what they said is extremely important, is paying attention to the history of struggles and building it from that position of justice. And justice in a broad sense, not just social, it could be economic, and a whole range of other issues. Is two of my dear colleagues, just an example, two of the most exciting indigenous scholar activists operating in the North American space and building indigenous solidarity across the world is Nick Estes and Melanie Yazzie, And Nick specifically comes from where the whole sort of the Standing Rock organizing took place, from the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. They co-founded, while they were students at the very institution that I'm at, something called Red Nation. And it's an indigenous liberation movement. And it basically began from a space of, again, anti-carceral, lot of injustices against indigenous people in our city and urban indigenous people, the various violence that they face. Today, it encompasses a wide range of issues. So I completely agree with both Kokila and Mitzi, is that the foundation is history of struggles. And they're, of course, incredibly, really front of the field thinkers and scholars, is rooted in this history of liberation and justice that is informing their work across the board.
I think that's awesome. I think, everybody gets carried away on things that really don't matter at the end of the day. The labels, is it okay to compartmentalize? How can I be like the most all around activist when all of these, what I'm hearing from all of you literally are the least of our concerns. How do we get past the political barriers that exist in our sunny little island, Singapore, in order to push for bigger work in voicing out and larger collective action, especially when it comes to speaking out and calling out for systemic change or political inaction? And I think this is something that would really apply to a lot of countries that have that same problem.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tough one, right? But okay, maybe I'll try and share some thoughts, but I'm really not any sort of authority on any of this. But I think that what builds power in our communities is organizing, right? So it's whether we're coming together with others at our workplace, others in our neighborhood, others in our college, our universities, whatever it is, to then speak as an organized collective voice on things. Because when it is one or two people or a few people who are disparate and spread out speaking up on things, it's much easier for an authoritarian regime to clamp down on them. It's much harder when there is people power, right? When there is a connectedness and strong sense of collective voice. And I would say, in that same vein, then to join organizations whose political commitments resonate with yours, and engage, because I think what we have is a lot of very small groups in Singapore, but we need to grow these spaces so that they become formidable forces for political change. So I think that is probably two things that I would point to. But the third thing is that a sort of different point in that I think there is a lot of risk in authoritarian regimes to be politically engaged, right? And in Singapore, we see and I think in the region, we see kind of growing intensification of authoritarianism and of state excesses and police excesses and things like that. So I think part of this work is also becoming more reflexive about our own risk thresholds and understanding where those boundaries lie and how we can work together with each other to build courage, because it is I think both important to know what we are comfortable with and what it looks like to start building courage, right? So to push ourselves only to the extent that we can bear, and working alongside others so that we don't feel so alone and so at risk when there is pushback and clampdown or state intimidation.
The final question for everyone, and we'll go around the room. I have two questions here. Regardless of how long you've been doing this, how do you keep your practice grounded in reality and inclusive of the varying needs of people? And what are some principles or truths that you hold close to your heart regardless?
So to me, I keep myself grounded in the way that I mentioned what activism was to me at the very beginning, by decentering myself and by listening to the people most marginalized and remembering that we have so much to learn from our environmental defenders, our small farmers, small fishing communities, the indigenous people, the land defenders, our workers, the urban poor. It's so important that we ground ourselves in the social realities of our countries and of the global context. And the values that I hold so dearly, and I think has popped up quite clearly in the conversations, is that we have to go beyond allyship into coalition, that we are fighting for common liberation together, and that we shouldn't be gatekeeping each other or competing with one another or thinking that we have to help, but really it's more of working together and coming together to build that future that we want together, and that we shouldn't just be anti-something. We have to be pro-joy and pro-love, and we have to show the beautiful world that we're trying to fight for through music and through art and through language exchange and through enjoying ourselves, because in a way that is what shows that the world that we're fighting for, it's possible, because it's already happening in small pockets here, and we just have to make it accessible to everyone.
Ground ourselves in the realities of the most marginalized communities. I think this is very true. I think early on, before I got into a call, I talked about how when I came back to Malaysia, I came back with these very different ideas. But then when I'm working with the communities, I realized, this is how it's being practiced. This is how, decolonizing, actions are being made. These people have been doing this for like decades, not decades, for hundreds of years. And it's sort of reaffirming my thoughts that everything is societies are fighting things, it's very similar. Either globally something is happening, these ideas are going through, outside Malaysia, but it has already been practiced here locally. And I'm really thankful to be part of this, of this movement. And I think the principles that, the truth that I really hold close to my heart is definitely working. How do I work meaningfully with others, right? So this is still, a work in progress for me, and it's also training other people in my team, for example, or other groups that we work together. How do we maintain those kind of trust, those kind of level of solidarity and empathy? It's a really tough work, but we should do it, like Missy said, and also Kokila said, with love, with joy. It does not have to be, sad all the time, stressful all the time. It's really important to take care, to do that collective care together, don't forget to smile. I think every now and then. Don't forget to smile, don't forget to rest. Yeah, every now and then a lot of activists don't do this, but I'm just putting it out there.
One of the things, if there is one little thing I've learned, is if at all possible, not in everything it is possible, to ground it in place. So all the work that I never say we do are place-based, community engaged, and grounded in stories. So if there is a principle, those are the three things. And I'll give a concrete example and I'll stop. So place-based, community engaged, and stories, grounded in stories. Last fall, I was teaching a class, and I can talk about the biodiversity crisis ad nauseum, and my students will roll their eyes and fall asleep. Right in the middle of the class, as we were going to launch the semester, one of the most horrendous mass bird die-off unfolded in New Mexico. 232 species died in that die-off within a matter of 2.5 months. All that said, I didn't even have to teach the class. They just went outside, they saw what they saw, they came back, they created art, they created stories, they found out more about each of these species and this and that. That is how you ground, is in truth, but also in stories and plays and so on. And all this idea of inclusion and all that, I keep hearing about that. If you're sincere, it's default. You don't have to intellectualize it. It just becomes default. Yeah.
I'm just like nodding so hard, my neck is hurting. Yeah, I think it's there is risks within our I think movement spaces and organizations that sometimes these ideas get fetishized, right? Like inclusion or care. Like I think these are when we show up with sincere care for people, it's just like you don't have to create a whole like set of practices and like working groups around care, and you don't have to always do it that way, right? It's also just like how we show up as people. So I think there's, for me, one of the important principles is learning from the margins, right? And I think it kind of echoes a lot of what has been said about listening deeply. But it's not just listening and learning from the margins about struggles and about difficulty, but actually the margins is where the most kinds of creative resistance is born, right? And because the margins are cut off from so many resources that the current systems provide, or so many processes, so many, because they're alienated from a lot of what our current realities and systems offer to people, then they're creating their own. And I think that is what it's like a lab. The margins are a lab for other ways we can live and other ways that we need to be imagining our futures. Like, what do we do when we don't have access to school? What does education look like? What does teaching our children look like? And can the rest, and it's not just about, people always talk about inclusion, like getting the margins more integrated, but the actual system we have is crap. We should not include people in that. We should dismantle it and create those alternate systems, right? So then I'm not looking at just how can we get more kids from the margins into our schools, but how can we learn what education means on the margins and dismantle schools as they exist now? Like, those should be questions that we're grappling with too, right? And so I think inclusion sometimes like simplifies or reduces what it means to really like learn from the margins. And I think another one for me is to not have sacred cows in terms of ideas that are, I think a lot of times activists can get dogmatic and get kind of fixated on certain orthodoxies. And if we're staying responsive, that means we're staying open to learning. Then we should be quick to abandon ideas that don't serve us in our communities anymore. And then I think also it comes fraught, right? Either people hold on very orthodoxically to things, or they feel a lot of shame and guilt that they have been practicing something that other people have now pointed out is harmful. I think we don't need to do either. We just need to be like, okay, oops, my bad, moving on. This is what we're going to do. And just be, and I think have a certain lightness with these ideas is important. And I think care work also really grounds us in reality, right? In the sense that, do you hear it now? So it's not just about like us showing up, right? But like, how can we offer like to look after the children of some moms so that they can attend a meeting, right? So I think care work looks like those material things. Like, how are we really stepping in if there are people in our movement spaces who have health conditions or need other kinds of care? How will we stepping up and rallying together to meet each other's needs? And even while there is scarcity, how are we creating and modeling abundance, right? I think playfulness is also important. And similarly, while we say making room for joy and all that, we have to make room also for anger and discomfort and disagreement, because some movement spaces can be very uncomfortable with those with more intense emotions and not make space for that. And I think also just the practice of bearing witness to each other's truths and struggles, because a lot of things can't change or transform now or immediately, and might take many, many years to transform our current struggles and pain. But I think bearing witness makes the pain easier to bear.
I'm going to try to summarize this incredible discussion that we had, but I think it's been quite clear that we get caught up in things that don't ultimately matter. Labeling and debating and definitions are ultimately irrelevant. That activism is about working together and participating actively and learning from each other, and not about helping. But it's truly about learning from each other, and that it's okay to not know and be all things. That ultimately we need to work and listen with the most marginalized and amplify their own learnings as well. So thank you so very much for this